Hesiod describes an ancient nuclear holocaust. In the texts of the ancient peoples, there's a description of a terrible war that shook the whole earth. This war, which may have been the reason for the beginning of the decline of that civilization, was conducted with the use of advanced weapons. The description of the ancient texts conveyed to us the image of a conflict which brought great destruction. That age-old conflict most likely resulted in a nuclear holocaust. It seems extreme, but reading the description of the ancient traditions, one cannot help but think of such possibility. The reference to a, quote, projectile which contained within itself the power of the universe, end quote, and to a, quote, white light flash, end quote, and to a, quote, fire unheard of that poured forth everywhere, end quote, and to, quote, a deadly dust, end quote, which covered those who were saved from destruction, can hardly be to go unnoticed. It can't be left to go unnoticed. It's worth conveying the texts of the peoples in which, among other things, the reader can distinguish the great similarity that exists and draw his own conclusions. Now we know from the Emerald Tablets written by Thoth Hermes Trismegistus the Atlantean, and I have a playlist of those tablets. It's worth listening to them as you're going around doing things in the house, because you'll see that they had even the power over demons, and they had tremendous advanced technology. They had interstellar travel. They also had interdimensional travel, and it's amazing. They were not to use such knowledge, but he says they did, and it was just a matter of time before divine intervention put an end to them because of that. Now, from Hesiod's Theogony, where the description of that terrible war between the gods and the Titans, quote unquote, is made, we transfer the following characteristic passage, quote, the land and the vast sea boiled, and the Titans were enveloped in a hot breath. And as the flame rose into the sky, brave as they were, the Titans were blinded. They were blinded by the white light from the lightning flash. Heat, unprecedented fire poured everywhere. And what the eye saw and what the ears heard, it was as if heaven and earth had joined together, end quote. A researcher might well suspect that the thunderbolt of Jupiter, that was the thunderbolt of the lightning rod of Zeus, that was the weapon that gave victory to the battle of the Titans, to the gods, was in fact no different than today's nuclear bomb. Even more characteristic is a description found in the Indian text Popol Vuh, quote, an iron bolt of lightning fell from the sky to the earth. The corpses of the men of the tribe of the Vrishnas and the Agikas became unrecognizable. Their hair and nails had fallen off, and feathers of the birds had changed color. The food had been poisoned, and those who had escaped the destruction were covered in a deadly dust, end quote. The Indian Bible Mahabharata says about this event, quote, it was a projectile that contained the power of the universe within it. It was a column of smoke and flame bright like 10,000 suns that rose with all its might. It was a new and unknown weapon, an iron thunderbolt that reduced the race of Rishnis and Adakas to ashes. The bodies were burned and no one could identify them. Hair and fingernails fell from the bodies. The birds turned white. A few hours later, all the food was contaminated. To escape this fire, the soldiers fell into the rivers with their clothes and weapons. A hot wind started blowing. The universe was enveloped in such heat as if it were sick with a high fever. The elephants and other beasts of war were struck down by the force of the weapon. The waters became so hot that everything living in them caught fire. A fatal spear like a staff of death. It measured 3 cubits and 6 feet, endowed with the thunderbolt power of the thousand-eyed Indra, devastating to all living creatures, end quote. Now the amazing similarity of the description of Popol Vuh and Mahabharata, as well as the provocatively similar names in the tribes Vrishnas and Agikas on the one hand and Vrishnas and Andakas on the other, lead us to the conclusion that it's not excluded that these two texts describe the same event. At another point in the Mahabharata, we read about the collision in the air of two of the weapons mentioned above. The two weapons met each other in midair, it said. Then the earth began to tremble together with all its mountains and seas and trees, and all living creatures were burned by the energy of the weapons and were badly affected. The heavens were on fire, and the 10 points of the horizon were filled with smoke, end quote. The Old Testament describes the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah can also be characterized as a mythological description of the sufferings of that great war. Quote, and the Lord rained down on Sodom and Gomorrah fire from heaven and destroyed these cities and all the surrounding areas. Another interesting element that the ancient traditions convey to us is that of the construction of the famous thunderbolt of Zeus by the Cyclops. According to ancient Greek mythology, the Cyclops were the ones who created this invincible weapon, which they gave to Zeus to defeat the Titans. From the commentaries of Artemidoros, we read the opinions of Eratosthenes, who argued that the conspiracy of the gods against the Titans took place in the Theaterium, where the Cyclops were making the terrible weapon, quote, with a cover over the fire so as not to spread the power of the lightning, end quote. So are we talking here of a nuclear plant whose walls protected the workers in it from the force of lightning, quote unquote, and whose scientists, who would apparently wear a special peculiar uniform with a helmet which gave them a different strange image, were named from mythology Cyclops, you know, like a helmet with one opening for, they thought it was the one eye on their forehead. So this hypothesis is quite bold, but also quite probable if one takes into account the above descriptions, as well as a 10,000-year-old rock painting found in a cave in Tassili Valley on the outskirts of the Sahara Desert, which shows the form of a man dressed in a strange uniform, strongly reminiscent of that of astronauts or nuclear plant workers. The helmet of the costume brings to mind the description of a cyclops, since it had a round skylight on the forehead to allow vision. And this was from Nexus Magazine, May 1998. I've translated this for you from a Greek article. Please leave your comments, and thank you for your support. Kindly support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.